hang on. Oh, it's loud. Hi. Okay. Right. So, this is not the second book, but I'm going to read a little bit of this because I I think it's only proper. Okay, so Nazi Germany and the Jews, Volume 1, The Years of Persecution from 1933 to 1939. Right. So, Chapter 1, Into the Third Reich. Now, forewarning, there might be things in this book that may be a bit hard to understand, and it's in a format that, obviously, it's a textbook, so, yes, but, it's a very beautifully written, oh my god. You won't see it, I don't think you will see it, and that's not like a commentary on you, it's just in general the way that this book is and the type of book it is. I don't think most people can't really see the beauty of it unless you really look into it. And for me, I'm just like, oh my god, I was absolutely sucked into this, but I never expected it. Even though I had to read this book within a span of like 3 days. I don't know if you remember when I was like rushing and I was saying I had to literally skim read this thick tome, but I had to. So, yeah. Anyway, Chapter 1, Into the Third Reich. I'll do my best. Well, it's actually, you do your best to listen, however you can. But this will benefit you if you're going to be learning about World War II, because this is where literally half the world was centered around. Aside from the Pacific side, this is the major thing. So, 1. The exodus from Germany of Jewish and left-wing artists and intellectuals began during the early months of 1933, almost immediately after Adolf Hitler's ascension to power on January 30. Hold on. Quick side note. Because I read to you Alan Turing, and I don't know if you remember the when things happened during the years, but it will be. This is why history is so fascinating, because for me, I have so many World War II books, and I've read a number of them, so it's really interesting to see many different texts around the same time period, because you always get like you literally adding richness and girth to what you already knew. So you can always compare to what you've listened to already, which is the Alan Turing thing. And I think you will be fascinated to know exactly what was going on during the things that I was reading to you that was happening to Alan Turing. So, there's that. Right. Anyway, continue. The philosopher and literary critic Walter Benjamin left Berlin for Paris on March 18th. 2 days later, he wrote to his colleague and friend, Gershom Scholem, who lived in Palestine. I can at least try to be certain that I did not act on impulse. Nobody among those who are close to me judges the matter differently. Switzerland confided in his fellow writer Arnold Zweig. It was too late for me to save anything. All that there is, lost. The conductors Otto Klemperer and Bruno Walter were compelled to flee. Walter was forbidden access to his Leipzig orchestra, and as he was about to conduct a special concert at the Berlin Philharmonic, he was informed that, according to rumours circulated by the propaganda ministry, the hall of the Philharmonic would be burned down if he did not withdraw. Walter left the country. Hans Hinkel, the new president of the Prussian Theatre Commission and also responsible for the de-Judaization of cultural life in Prussia, explained in April 6th Frankfurter Zeitung that Klemperer and Walter had disappeared from the musical scene because there was no way to protect them against the mood of a German public long provoked by Jewish artistic liquidators. Bruno Walter's concert was not cancelled. Richard Strauss conducted this. This, in turn, led Arturo Toscanini to announce in early June that, in protest, he would not conduct at the Bayreuth Festival. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels noted laconically in his diary, Toscanini cancelled Bayreuth. The same public mood must have convinced the Dresden Opera House to hound out its musical director Fritz Busch, no Jew himself, but accused of having too many contacts with Jews and of having invited too many Jewish artists to perform. Other methods were also used. When the Hamburg Philharmonic Society published its program for the celebration of Brahms' 100th birthday, It was informed that Chancellor Hitler would be ready to give his patronage to the celebrations on condition that all Jewish artists, among them the pianist Rudolf Serkin, disappear from the program. The offer was gladly accepted. The rush to de-Judaize the arts produced its measure of confusion. Thus, on April 1st, a Lübeck newspaper reported that in the small town of Euten, in nearby Schleswig-Holstein, the last concert of the winter season had offered a surprise. In place of the Kiel City Orchestra's excellent cellist, John Day J. Professor Hofmeier presented a piano recital. We are informed that it has been established that John Day J. is Jewish. Soon after, however, there was a telegram from Day J. to Hofmeier. Claim false. Perfect document. On May 5th, the district party leader, S., announced that the Dutch-born German citizen Day J. was a Lutheran, as several generations of his forebears had been. The relief felt at not being Jewish must have been immense. In his barely fictionalized rendition of the career of the actor and later manager of the Berlin National Theatre, Goering's protégé, Gustav Gründgens, Klaus Mann, described that very peculiar euphoria. But even if the Nazis remained in power, what had he, Gründgens, to fear from them? He belonged to no party, and he wasn't a Jew. This fact, above all others, that he wasn't a Jew, struck Hendrik all of a sudden as immensely comforting and important. He had never in the past estimated the true worth of this considerable and unsuspected advantage. He wasn't a Jew, and so he could be forgiven everything. A few days after the Reichstag elections of March 5th, all members of the Prussian Academy of the Arts received a confidential letter from the poet Gottfried Benn, asking them whether they were ready, in view of the changed political situation, to remain members of the parent Academy of Arts and Sciences, in which case they would have to abstain from any criticism of the new German regime. Moreover, the members would have to manifest the right national cultural attitude by signing a declaration of loyalty. 9 of the 27 members of the literature section replied negatively, among them the novelists Alfred Döblin, Thomas Mann, Jacob Wassermann, and Ricardo Huck. Mann's brother, the novelist Heinrich Mann, had already been expelled because of his left-wing political views. Max von Schillings, the new president of the Prussian Academy, put pressure on the Aryan novelist Ricardo Huck not to resign. There was an exchange of letters, which Huck, in her final retort, alluding to Heinrich Mann's dismissal and to the resignation of Alfred Döblin, who was Jewish. You mentioned the gentleman Heinrich Mann and Dr. Döblin. It is true that I did not agree with Heinrich Mann, and I did not always agree with Dr. Döblin, although on some matters I did. In any case, I can only wish that all non-Jewish Germans would seek as conscientiously to recognize and to do what is right, would be as open, honest, and decent as I have always found him to be. My judgment he could not have acted any differently than he did in the face of the harassment of the Jews. That my resignation from the Academy is not motivated by sympathy for these gentlemen, in spite of the particular respect and sympathy I have for Dr. Döblin, is something everyone who knows me, either personally or from my books, will recognize. Herewith, I declare my resignation from the Academy. Living in Vienna, the novelist Franz Werfel, who was Jewish, perceived things differently. He was quite willing to sign the declaration, and on March 19th, he wired Berlin for the necessary forms. On May 8th, Schillings informed Werfel that he was not to remain a member of the Academy. 2 days later, a number of his books were among those publicly burned. In the summer of 1933, after the establishment of the Reichschamber of Culture, Reichskulturkammer, or RKK, and as part of it, the Reich Association of German Writers, Werfel tried again. Please note that I am a Czechoslovak citizen, he wrote, and a resident of Vienna. At the same time, I wish to declare that I have always been able to keep my distance from any political organization or activity. As a member of the German minority in Czechoslovakia, resident in Austria, I am subject to the laws of these states. Needless to say, Werfel never received an answer. The novelist possibly wanted to ensure the German sale of his forthcoming novel, The 40 Days of Musa Dagh, a story based on the extermination of the Armenians by the Turks during the World War. The book was in fact published in the Reich at the end of 1933, but finally banned in February of 1934. Albert Einstein was visiting the United States on January 30th, 1933. It did not take him long to react. Describing what was happening in Germany as a psychic illness of the masses, he ended his return journey in Ostend, Belgium, and never again set foot on German soil. The Kaiser Wilhelm Society dismissed him from his position. The Prussian Academy of Sciences expelled him. His citizenship was rescinded. Einstein was no longer a German. Prominence and fame shielded no one. Max Reinhardt was expelled from the directorship of the German theatre, which was transferred to the German people, and fled the Reich. Max Liebermann, at 86, possibly the best-known German painter of the time, was too old to emigrate when Hitler came to power. Formerly president of the Prussian Academy of Arts, and in 1933 its honorary president, he held the highest German decoration, the Pour le Mérite. On May 7th, Liebermann resigned from the Academy. As the painter Oskar Kokoschka wrote from Paris in a published letter to the editor of Frankfurter Zeitung, none of Liebermann's colleagues deemed it necessary to express a word of recognition or sympathy. Isolated and ostracized, Liebermann died in 1935. Only 3 Aryan artists attended his funeral. His widow survived him. When in March 1943 the police arrived with a stretcher for the bedridden 85-year-old woman to begin her deportation to the east, she committed suicide by swallowing an overdose of the barbiturate veronal. As peripheral as it may seem in hindsight, the cultural domain was the first from which Jews and leftists were massively expelled. Schillings's letter was sent immediately after the March of 1933 Reichstag elections, and publication of Hinkel's interview preceded the promulgation of the Civil Service Law of April 7th, which will be discussed further on. Thus, even before launching their first systematic anti-Jewish measures of exclusion, the new rulers of Germany had turned against the most visible representatives of the Jewish spirit, that henceforth was to be eradicated. In general, the major anti-Jewish measures the Nazis would take from then on in the various domains were not only acts of terror, but also symbolic statements. This dual function expressed the pervasive presence of ideology within the system. Its tenets had to be ritually reasserted, with the persecution of chosen victims as part of the ongoing ritual. There was more. The double significance of the regime's initiatives engendered a kind of split consciousness in a great part of the population. For instance, people might not agree with the brutality of the dismissals of Jewish intellectuals from their positions, but they welcomed the cleansing of the excessive influence of Jews from German cultural life. Even some of the most celebrated German exiles, such as those of Thomas Mann, were not immune, at least for a time, from this kind of dual vision of the events. A non-Jew, though married to one, Mann was away from Germany when the Nazis came to power, and he did not return. Writing to Einstein on May 15th, he mentioned the painfulness to him of the very idea of exile. For me to have been forced into this role, something thoroughly wrong and evil must surely have taken place. And it is my deepest conviction that this whole German Revolution is indeed wrong and evil. The author of The Magic Mountain was no less explicit months later, in a letter to his one-time friend, the ultra-nationalist historian of literature, Ernst Bertram, who had become a staunch supporter of the new regime. "We shall see. I wrote to you a good while back and you replied defiantly. Of course we shall. Have you begun to see?" "No. for they are holding your eyes closed with bloody hands, and you accept the protection only too gladly. The German intellectuals, forgive the word, it is intended as purely objective term, will in fact be the very last to begin to see, for they have too deeply, too shamefully collaborated and exposed themselves. But in fact, much ambiguity remained in Mann's attitudes. To ensure the continuing publication and sale of his books in Germany, he carefully avoided speaking out against the Nazis for several years. And, at the outset, some Nazi organizations, such as the Nationalist Socialist Students Association, were careful about him as well. Thomas Mann's books were not included in the notorious May 10th, 1933 Auto da Fe. Mann's ambivalence, or worse, particularly with regard to the Jews, surfaces in his diary entries during this first phase. Isn't, after all, something significant and revolutionary on a grand style happening in Germany? He wrote on April 4th, 1933. As for the Jews, that Alfred Kerr's arrogant and poisonous Jewish garbling of the Nietzsche is now excluded is not altogether a catastrophe. And also, the de-Judaization of justice isn't one. He indulged in such remarks time and again, but it perhaps is in the diary entry of July 15th, 1934, that Mann expressed his strongest resentment. I was thinking about the absurdity of the fact the Jews, whose rights in Germany are being abolished and who are being pushed out, have an important share in the spiritual issues which express themselves, obviously with a grimace in the political system, Nazism, and that they can in good part be considered as the precursors of the anti-liberal turn. As examples, Mann mentioned the poet Karl Wolfskehl, a member of the esoteric, literary and intellectual circle around the poet Stefan George, and particularly the Munich eccentric Oskar Goldberg. There is some discrepancy between such expressions as an important share, in good part, and the precursors of the anti-liberal turn, and these two marginal examples. He went further. In general, I think that many Jews in Germany agree in their deepest being with their new role as tolerated guests who are not part of anything except, it goes without saying, as far as taxes are concerned. Mann's anti-Nazi position was not to become clear, unambiguous, and public until early 1936. Mann's attitude illustrates the pervasiveness of split consciousness, and thus explains the ease with which Jews were expelled from cultural life. Apart from a few courageous individuals such as Ricardo Huch, there was no countervailing force in that domain, or, for that matter, in any other. Hitler certainly had no split conscience regarding anything Jewish. Yet, in 1933 at least, he deferred to Winifred Wagner, the English-born widow of Richard Wagner's son Siegfried, who was the guiding force at Bayreuth. Amazingly, as Friedrich Spotz put it, that year Hitler even allowed the Jews Alexander Kipnis and Emanuel Liszt to sing in his presence. Well, that's all I read for that. That's just part 1 of chapter 1, but I don't know how you feel about, I don't know how much you understood about this. Wait, hang on. What did you say? Yes, see, it's not for everyone. This is a kind of book that normally high schoolers would not. There's a reason why this is a college book. I mean, this is the definitive book on the Holocaust. Honestly, yeah. I mean, yeah, I know. I mean, I could literally read okay. So that was just part 1. I don't know how much of that you understood, but where I understood it when I was reading it, and I wrote things to basically simplify each paragraph. And so I was writing that it seems like, people knew that it was going to be bad, the time period. that people being threatened, that ex-Jews were in Prussia, that people fled from the lack of protection, small revolt against anti-Jews, people associated with Jews are targeted too, because they were. Hitler's supporters supports patrons, Jewish accusations, not Jewish equals safe, stay or not with new policy, resignation due to anti-Jewish moods, Jews asked to quit, fired from jobs, books were burned, therefore tried not to get fired, met with silence, ignored. Yeah, there's a lot of ignoring going on. Let's see. To ensure book sales. Oh yeah. People wanted to do that. They wanted to make sure that they still sold books because they kept being burned. Books were later banned. Einstein knew that Germany was going insane. That's what he meant by psychic illness of the masses, is his intelligent way of saying that they're going bat-crap crazy. Einstein was stripped of everything. Yeah, he lost all of his status in Germany. Great German painter was fired. Colleagues stayed silent. Man died lonely. Yeah, nobody came to his funeral. Wife died alone and depressed. Yeah, she committed suicide. Jewish culture was first to go. Yeah, it was being eliminated. This is a process of it. Civil service law is a horrible law. That's what started everything in terms of policy. Nazis started to systematically go against Jews politically. Yes, they did with that law. It was ritualistic. Let's see. Wanted to remove Jews from culture. Duality in German mindsets to and against and for the Jews. So against the Jews, and morally unsettled by Jewish treatment. They were not okay what's going on with Jews. It's a misconception. Everyone tends to think that Nazi Germany, everyone hated. No, a lot of people didn't even know what was going on. A lot of people hated it, really, but they didn't do anything. Thomas Mann voiced his opinions. Something is going wrong. Author's friend was stupid. Tell's friend is being blamed for the sale of protection. Mann kept book sales by not explicitly voicing against Nazis for some time. Yep. He just kept himself quiet. Mixed thoughts on Jews was most people. Jewish exclusion may be not too bad yet. German Revolution. Oh yeah, that's what they thought. It was a German Revolution. And then Mann says it's dumb for Jews who have influence in Nazism are being pushed out, which could lead to anti-Nazism, I think is what I wrote. Or something. Jews are excluded. No, Jews are excluded except for their money. Yeah, Jews, yeah, they were excluded for everything except in terms of taxes, because, they have money. Nazi Germany needs their money. Okay. Ultimately going against Nazism, people. Duality of thought. Yeah, people mixed. Jews easily expelled with little opposition. Yeah, Jews. It's very clear early on that Jews didn't know what was happening. They didn't know. They didn't know how the severity. No idea how bad it was going to get. No, this pervades everything. That's how the Jews even got to be treated so poorly and eventually, put into mass genocide. People wonder how people ask the question, how did the Holocaust happen? But this is how it happens. This book is marvelous in the fact that it literally shows you exactly how all of this even happened. Anyway, Hitler knows what he wants and thinks he knows exactly what he wants. One time only, Hitler allowed for personal Jewish interaction. So there we go. If everything was confusing, I hope it isn't all that confusing now. I read you what I simplified, and that's what happened. I hope it makes sense. Yeah, I don't know if you can tell, but literally people didn't know what was going on. People had no idea of the severity of the things. Even Nazi Germany had no idea where they were going with this. Only Hitler kind of knew. He had an idea of it, but you know more of that as the book continues. But yes, that was how this book is introduced. What's happening? This is basically a little taste. He gives you a very large-scale picture of things, and he goes back and goes systematically through to tell you what is going on. So that's the beginning part to that book, and the beginning part of essentially what is to be the Holocaust. This isn't the Holocaust yet. This is the years building up to it. So there's that. So I don't know. Whenever I know you will talk about the Holocaust in your socials class. Yeah, for your history. Yeah, so you will. Anyway, I know it's. I will say, if I were to look at this from another person's view, this book is quite dense. But it's honestly though, looking at it, it's like, oh, okay, to be honest, the Alan Turing book too. I mean, this is another reason why I was so amazed, because for most people that book can be considered dense, but honestly though, to me, no, these books aren't dense at all. They're written so nice. Honestly though, Alan Turing book is not as dense as the textbooks for the Holocaust, but the Holocaust books themselves, what makes them so extraordinary in addition is that the author is a good writer, and also he says everything as so matter of fact. Even the worst, they say some absolutely monstrous things in these books. You have no idea. But my God, the way they're written, it's so matter of fact. You can't even believe how casually it's said. It's daunting. But anyway, yeah, there were so many moments when I was reading these two books, these tomes, that I got so emotionally angry. I was so not okay. But anyway, right. Sorry. Okay. Now on to things I think you can stomach, which is book 2. So, right. A George Smiley novel by John le Carre. Book 2. A Murder of Quality. Forward. There are probably a dozen great schools of whom it will be confidently asserted that Khan is their deliberate image. But he who looks among their common rooms for the D'Arcys, Fieldings, and Hects will search in vain. John le Carre. Now give me a moment while I go over and do the thing that I need to do. Hang on. If I could do... Oh my God, why? Why do you do this? Sorry. There we go. Introduction. John le Carre, December 1989. The origins of most of my books are by now a mystery to me, even if they were not at the time, but A Murder of Quality is clearly set in my memory. It was my second book, and I wrote it in the flush of the modest success enjoyed by my first, Call for the Dead. I began it in 1961 when I arrived in Bonn ahead of my family to take up a junior post at the British Embassy, and by the time it appeared, I had The Spy Who Came In From the Cold in my sights. I still had a notion in those days of writing a thriller a year, and adding a much-needed few £100 to my foreign service salary. Or so I told myself, even if my ambitions were secretly larger. I wrote A Murder of Quality first in the gloomy pension in Bad Godesberg, where junior British diplomats were stabled while they awaited accommodation. Then in the tiny house in the Gringstrasse, where we lived with our 2 children and our au pair. In consequence, I wrote the book lying down, on beds, in notebooks, in the few snatched hours that were left to me by family and diplomatic life. My sources were extremely present to me, as they will be to the reader. I hate English boarding schools. I found them monstrous and still do, probably because I began my boarding school career at the age of 5 at a place called St. Martin's, Northwood, and I did not end it till I was 16, when I flatly refused to return to Westcott House, Sherborne, on the solid grounds that I would take no more of such institutions. Oh my God, he went to Sherborne, that's Alan Turing School, sorry. Yet, as life would have it, 8 years later, I was banged up once again, this time at Eton as a junior modern languages master. Eton was not Sherborne at all. Sherborne, in my day, had been rustic, colonialist, chauvinist, militarist, religious, patriotic, and repressive. Boys beat other boys. Housemasters beat boys, and even the headmaster turned his hand to beating boys if the crime was held to be sufficiently heinous, or school discipline was thought to be slipping. I don't know whether masters beat masters, but in any case, I loathe them, and I loathe their grotesque allegiances most of all. To this day, I can find no forgiveness for their terrible abuse of the charges entrusted to them. Only adults had nervous breakdowns in those days, so the methods of survival for boys who refused to join the system were animal cunning, internal emigration, as the Germans call it, or simply getting the hell out. I practiced the first two, then opted for the third, and took myself to Switzerland. But Eton was an English social class of its own. A graduate of Eton is an Etonian first, and a citizen second. He enjoys, during his schooling, more personal access to the staff than in any other school I am aware of, and an extremely high standard of teaching. Certainly the system had its barbarisms, but it awarded more privacy, more sovereignty to its pupils, more self-esteem, some would say arrogance, than I had imagined possible. As a young schoolmaster, I had the sensation of embarking on a second, vicarious education of my own, reacting sometimes against it, sometimes for it, but never calmly, never with any sense of integration or acceptance. Probably, since I had not yet begun to write, I had not realized quite how much of an outsider I was anyway, constantly repelled by the institutions that drew me. So, the components are there for you to dissect as you will. An outrage at my Sherborne schooling, a fascination with the mores of the Etonian class, an attraction to it all, a revulsion from it, a bestiary of frighting adults drawn from the timid chambers of my institutional and largely parentless childhood, and a spiritual brutality towards young minds that is in this far from perfect story takes the form of bloody violence. As to poor Stella Road and a non-conformism, they came from even further back, from the days when my brother and I spent our Sundays in the chapels and the tabernacles of coastal Dorset, listening to the counsel of far humbler gods than he who guided the untroubled conscience of the British ruling classes. Rereading the book now, I find a flawed thriller redeemed by a ferocious and quite funny social comment. Most of all, I recognize the darkness of those old stone walls that formed the limits of my childhood and left me for the rest of my life with an urge to fight off whatever threatened to enclose me. So, quick aside, oh my god, he went to Sherborne? Yo! I'm freaking out! And Dorset, yo! He was in the same vicinity as freaking Alan Turing! Anyway, sorry. Okay. A Murder of Quality. Chapter 1. Black Candles. The greatest of Cairns School had been ascribed by common consent to Edward VI, whose educational zeal is ascribed by history to the Duke of Somerset. But Cairn prefers the respectability of the monarch to the questionable politics of his adviser, drawing strength from the conviction that great schools like Tudor kings were ordained in heaven. And indeed, its greatness is little short of miraculous. Founded by obscure monks, endowed by a sickly boy king, and dragged from oblivion by a Victorian bully, Cairn had straightened its colour, scrubbed its rustic hands and face, and presented itself shining to the courts of the 20th century. And in the twinkling of an eye, the Dorset bumpkin was London's darling. Dick Whittington had arrived. Cairn had parchments in Latin, seals in wax, and Lammas land behind the abbey. Cairn had property, cloisters, and woodworm, a whipping block, and a line in the Doomsday Book. But what more did it need to instruct the sons of the rich? And they came. Each half they came, for terms are not elegant things, so that throughout the whole afternoon the trains would unload sad groups of black-coated boys onto the station platform. They came in great cars that shone with mournful purity. They came to bury poor King Edward, trundling handcarts over the cobbled streets, or carrying tuck boxes like little coffins. Some wore gowns, and when they walked they looked like crows or black angels come for the burying. Some followed singly, like undertakers' mutes, and you could hear the clip of their boots as they went. They were always in mourning at Caen. The small boys because they must stay, and the big boys because they must leave, the masters because respectability was underpaid, and now, as the Lent half, as the Easter term was called, drew to its end, the cloud of gloom was as firmly settled as ever over the grey towers of Caen. Gloom and the cold. The cold was crisp and sharp as flint. It cut the faces of the boys as they moved slowly from the deserted playing fields after the school match. It pierced their black topcoats and turned their stiff, pointed collars into icy rings round their necks. Frozen, they plodded from the field to the long-walled road which led to the main tuck shop and the town, the line gradually dwindling into groups, and the groups into pairs. Two boys, who looked even colder than the rest, crossed the road and made their way along a narrow path which led towards a distant but less populated tuck shop. "I think I shall die forever if I have to watch one of those beastly rugger games again. The noise is fantastic," said one. He was tall with fair hair, and his name was Cayley. "People only shout because the Dons are watching from the pavilion," the others rejoined. "That's why each house has to stand together, so that the house Dons can swank about how loud the houses shout." "What about Rode?" asked Cayley. "What does he stand with us and make us shout then?" "He's not a house Don, just a bloody usher." "He's sucking up to house Dons all the time. You can see him in the quad between lessons buzzing around the big men. All the junior masters do." Cayley's companion was a cynical red-haired boy called Perkins, captain of Fielding's house. "I've been to sea with Rode," said Cayley. "Rode's hell. He wears brown boots." "What was tea like?" "Bleak. Funny how tea gives them away. Mrs. Rhodes quite decently, though homely in a pebbly sort of way. Doilies and china birds. Food's good. Women's Institute, but good. Rhodes doing core next half, then I'll put the lid on it. He's so keen, bouncing about all the time. You can tell he's not a gentleman. You know where he went to school?" "No?" "Branksome Grammar. Fielding told my mamma when she came over from Singapore last half." "God, where's Branksome?" "On the coast, near Bournemouth. I haven't been to tea with anyone except Fielding." Perkins added, after a slight pause, "You get roast chestnuts and crumpets. You're never allowed to thank him, you know. He says emotionalism is only for the lower classes. That's typical of Fielding. He's not like a Don at all. I think boys bore him. The whole house goes to tea with him once a half, and he has us in turn for at a time, and that's about the only time he talks to most men." They walked on in silence for a while until Perkins said, "Fielding's giving another dinner party tonight." "He's pushing the boat out these days," Cayley replied with disapproval. "Suppose the food in your house is worse than ever?" "It's his last half before he retires. He's entertaining every Don and all the wine separately by the end of the half. Black candles every evening, 4 morning. Hell's extravagant." "Yes, I suppose it's a sort of gesture." "My pater says he's queer." They crossed the road and disappeared into the tuck shop, where they continued to discuss the weighty affairs of Mr. Terence Fielding, until Perkins drew their meeting reluctantly to a close. Being a poor hand at science, he was unfortunately obliged to take extra tuition in the subject. The dinner party to which Perkins had alluded that afternoon was now drawing to a close. Mr. Terence Fielding, senior housemaster of Caen, gave himself some more port and pushed the decanter wearily to his left. It was his port, the best he had. There was enough of the best to last the half, and after that, be damned. He felt a little tired after watching the match, and a little drunk, and a little bored with Shane Hext and her husband. Shane was so hideous, massive and enveloping like a faded Valkyrie. All that black hair. He should have asked someone else. The Snows, for instance. But he was too clever. Or Felix D'Arcy. But D'Arcy interrupted. Oh well. A little later he would annoy Charles Hext, and Hext would get in a pet and leave early. Hecht was fidgeting, wanting to light his pipe, but Fielding damn well wouldn't have it. Hecht could have a cigar if he wanted to smoke, but his pipe could stay in his dinner jacket pocket, where it belonged, or didn't belong, and his athletic profile could remain unadorned. Cigar, Hecht? No, thanks, Fielding. I say, do you mind if I could recommend the cigars. Young Havelake sent them from Havana. His father's ambassador there, you know? Yes, dear, says Shane tolerantly. Vivian Havelake was in Charles' troop when Charles was commandant of the cadets. Good boy, Havelake, Hecht observed, and pressed his lips together to show he was a strict judge. It's amusing how things have changed, Shane Hecht said, this rapidly with a rather wooden smile, as if it wasn't really amusing. Such a great world we live in now. I remember before the war when Charles inspected the corpse on the White Horse. We don't do that kind of thing now, do we? I got nothing against Mr. Iredale as commandant, nothing at all. What was his regiment, Terence, do you know? I'm sure he does it very nicely, whatever they do now in the Corps. He gets on so well with the boys, doesn't he? His wife's such a nice person. I wonder why they can never keep their servants. I hear Mr. Rode will be helping out with the Corps next half. Poor little Rode, said Fielding slowly, running about like a puppy trying to earn his biscuits. He tries so hard. Have you seen him cheering at school marches? He'd never seen a game of rugger before he came here, you know. They don't play rugger at grammar schools. It's all soccer. Do you remember when he first came, Charles? It was fascinating. He lay very low at first, drinking us in. The games, the vocabulary, the manners. Then one day it was as if he had been given the power of speech, and he spoke in our language. It was amazing, like plastic surgery. It was Felix D'Arcy's work, of course. I've never seen anything quite like it before. Dear Mrs. Rode, said Shane Hecht in that voice of abstract vagueness which she reserved for her most venomous pronouncements. So sweet and such simple taste, don't you think? I mean, whoever would have dreamed of putting those china ducks on the wall? Big ones at the front and little ones at the back. Charming, don't you think? Like one of those tea shops. I wonder where she bought them. I must ask her. I'm told her father lives near Bournemouth. Oh, it must be so lonely for him, don't you think? Such a vulgar place. No one to talk to. Fielding sat back and surveyed his own table. The silver was good. The best in Caen, he had heard it said, and he was inclined to agree. This half he had nothing but black candles. It was the sort of thing people remembered when you'd gone. Dear old Terrace, marvellous host. He dined every member of the staff during his last half, you know. Wives, too. Black candles, rather touching. It broke his heart giving up his house. But it must annoy Charles Hecht. Shane would like that. Shane would egg him on until she hated Charles, because within her great, ugly body she was as cunning as a snake. Fielding looked at Hecht and then at Hecht's wife, and she smiled back at him, the slow, rotten smile of a whore. For a moment, Fielding thought of Hex pasturing in that thick body. It was a scene redolent of Lautrec. Yes, that was it. Charles, pompous and top-hatted, seated stiffly upon the plush coverlet. She was massive, pendulous, and bored. The image pleased him. So perverse to consign that fool Hex from the Spartan cleanliness of Caen to the brothels of 19th century Paris. Fielding began talking, pontificating rather, with an air of friendly objectivity which he knew Hecht would resent. When I look back on my 30 years at Caen, I realize I have achieved rather less than a road sweeper. They were watching him now. I used to regard a road sweeper as a person inferior to myself. Now I rather doubt it. Something is dirty. He makes it clean, and the state of the world is advanced. But what have I done? Entrench the ruling class, which is distinguished by neither talent, culture, nor wit, kept alive for one more generation the distincts of a dead age. Charles Hecht, who had never perfected the art of not listening to Fielding, grew red and fussed at the other end of the table. Don't we teach them, Fielding? What about our successes, our scholarships? I have never taught a boy in my life, Charles. Usually the boy wasn't clever enough. Occasionally I wasn't. In most boys, you see, perception dies with puberty. In a few, it persists, though where we find it, we take good care at Caen to kill it. If it survives our efforts, the boy wins a scholarship. Bear with me, Shane. It's my last half. Last half or not? You're talking through your hat, Fielding, said Hecht angrily. That is traditional at Caen. These successes, as you call them, are the failures, the rare boys who have not learned the lessons of Caen. They have ignored the cult of mediocrity. We can do nothing for them. But for the rest, for the puzzled little clerics and the blind little soldiers, for them, the truth of Caen is written on the wall, and they hate us. Hecht laughed rather heavily. Why do so many come back there so much? Why did they remember us and come and see us? Because we, dear Charles, are the writing on the wall. The one lesson of Caen they never forget. They come back to read us, don't you see? It is from us they learnt the secret of life, that we grow old without growing wise. They realized that nothing happened when we grew up. No blinding lights on the road to Damascus, no sudden feeling of maturity. Fielding put his head back and gazed at the clumsy Victorian moulding on the ceiling, and the halo of dirt right round the light rose. We just got a little older. We made the same jokes, thought the same thoughts, wanted the same things. Year in, year out, Hecht, we were the same people. Not wiser, not better. We haven't had an original thought between us for the last 50 years of our lives. They saw what a trick it all was, Caen and us. Our academic dress, our schoolroom jokes, our wise little offerings of guidance. And that's why they come back year after year of their puzzled, barren lives to gaze fascinated at you and me, Hecht, like children at a grave, searching for the secret of life and death. Oh yes, they have learned that from us. Hecht looked at Fielding, in silence for a moment. To counteract, said Fielding, in a slightly conciliatory way, but Hecht's eyes were still upon him. If that's a joke, he began, and his wife observed with satisfaction that he was very angry indeed. I wish I knew, Charles, Fielding replied with apparent earnestness. I really wish I knew. I used to think it was clever to confuse comedy with tragedy. Now I wish I could distinguish them. You rather like that. They had coffee in the drawing room, where Fielding resorted to gossip. But Hecht was not to be drawn. Fielding rather wished he had let him light his pipe. Then he recalled his vision of the Hects in Paris, and it restored him. He had been rather good this evening. There were moments when he convinced himself. While Shane fetched a coat, the two men stood together in the hall, but neither spoke. Shane returned, an ermine stole, yellow with age, draped over her great white shoulders. She inclined her head to the right, smiled, and held out her hand to Fielding, the fingers down. "Terence, darling," she said, as Fielding kissed her fat knuckles. "So kind. And in your last half, you must dine with us before you go. So sad. So few of us left." She smiled again, half closing her eyes to indicate the emotional disturbance, and followed her husband into the street. It was still bitterly cold, and snow was in the air. Fielding closed and carefully bolted the door behind them, perhaps a fraction earlier than the courtesy required, and returned to the dining room. Hecht's port glass was still about half full. Fielding picked it up and carefully poured the contents back into the decanter. He hoped Hecht wasn't too upset. He hated people to dislike him. He snuffed the black candles and damped their wicks between his forefinger and thumb. Switching on the light, he took from the sideboard a sixpenny notebook and opened it. It contained his list of dining guests for the remainder of the half. With his fountain pen, he placed a neat tick against the name Hecht. They were done. One Wednesday, he would have the roads. The husband was quite good value, but she, of course, was hell. It was not always the way with married couples. The wives, as a rule, were so much more sympathetic. He opened the sideboard and took from it a bottle of brandy and a tumbler. Holding them both in the same hand, he shuffled wearily back to the drawing room, resting his other hand on the wall as he went. God. He felt odd, old, suddenly. That thin line of pain across the chest, that heaviness in the legs and feet. Such an effort being with people, on stage all the time. He hated to be alone. But people bored him. Being alone was like being tired, but unable to sleep. Some German poet had said that, he quoted it once, "You may sleep, but I must dance." Something like that. That's how I am, thought Fielding. That's how Khan is, too. An old satire, dancing to the music. The music grew faster and the bodies older, but they must dance on. There were young men waiting in the wings. It had been funny once dancing the old dances in the new world. He poured himself some more brandy. He'd be pleased to leave in a way, even though he'd have to go on teaching something else. But it had its beauty, Khan. The abbey close in spring, the flamingo figures of boys waiting for the ritual of worship, the ebb and flow of children like the seasons of the year, and the old men dying among them. He wished he could paint the pageant of Khan in the fallow browns of autumn. What a shame, thought Fielding, that a mind so perceptive of beauty had no talents for creation. He looked at his watch. 11:45. Nearly time to go out. To dance. And not to sleep. Okay.